Good afternoon, Lions fans. Pay close attention here, because what's happening in Detroit right now is no coincidence. There's something very clear taking shape behind the scenes, and only those locked into the details are really noticing it. Everything we're seeing at this stage of the offseason points in one direction, a full focus on the draft, but it goes beyond that. The real question is just how far this front office is willing to go when the moment arrives. Because the way things are unfolding, this doesn't look like a team that's going to sit back and watch. It looks like something aggressive could be coming, because here's the reality Lions fans need to understand. We are officially in that window where rumors start flying everywhere. Some of them are real, some are smoke, and some are straight up noise. But when you filter through it carefully, you start to see patterns. And one of the biggest patterns right now is this. Detroit is being connected to multiple trade scenarios, and not just small moves. We're talking about potentially impactful tone-setting decisions. Let's start with the idea that feels the most grounded in logic. There's growing discussion about the possibility of Detroit making a move for an edge rusher if the draft doesn't fall the way they want. And this isn't random speculation, it's actually tied to a very real concern. What happens if the player they want at edge simply isn't there in round 2? We've seen drafts play out like that before. Boards don't always fall clean, and when they don't, the teams that are prepared with backup plans are the ones that stay ahead. And this is where the idea of trading for a young, proven edge starts to make a lot of sense. A player in his mid-20s still on a manageable deal who could immediately step in and fill a massive need opposite Aiden Hutchinson. That's not just a luxury move, that's a strategic response to uncertainty. And if the cost is a day 2 pick, you're essentially balancing risk versus proven production. That's a conversation worth having. Now shift to another layer of this, the possibility of trading up in the draft. This is where things get really interesting. The idea of moving up from pick 17 into the top 10 if a specific player starts to fall. That's the kind of aggressive move that can reshape your roster overnight. Especially if that player fills one of your biggest weaknesses, like the offensive line. Because let's be honest here, the Lions still have a major question mark at tackle opposite Penei Sewell. Yes, they addressed things in free agency, but those were short-term solutions, band-aids, not long-term answers. And if there's one thing this front office has shown, it's that they're not satisfied with temporary fixes when they believe they can lock down a position for years. But here's the counterpoint, and it's a very real one. Detroit has multiple needs across the roster. Edge, tackle, cornerback, depth at linebacker. This isn't a one-hole team, so the idea of giving up multiple picks to move up might not align with their overall strategy of building depth. That's why even though a trade-up sounds exciting, it doesn't necessarily feel like the most likely path. Then you get into the more controversial discussions, like the idea of bringing in a quarterback as a developmental or experimental piece. And this is where things start to separate opinion from philosophy, because when you look at the type of offense Detroit runs, it's built on timing, accuracy, and decision making. So when you hear talk about adding a quarterback who struggles heavily with completion percentage and consistency, it raises a serious question. Does that even fit what this team is trying to do? And beyond the on-field concerns, there's also the leadership factor. This team is built in the image of Dan Campbell. Toughness, accountability, and resilience. Every move they make reflects that identity. So when evaluating potential additions, it's not just about talent, it's about mindset. It's about whether that player aligns with the culture that's been built inside that locker room. Now let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture, because this is where everything connects. The Lions entered free agency with two clear, undeniable needs: edge rusher and offensive tackle. And while they made moves to stabilize those positions, they didn't solve them long term. That was never the intention. The intention was always to get to the draft and attack those needs head on. And with only 2 picks inside the top 100, 17 and 50, the pressure is real. These aren't just picks. These are opportunities to define the direction of this roster. Fans are not just hoping those needs get addressed. They're expecting it, because if you ignore those positions again, you're essentially repeating the same cycle and expecting a different outcome. And that's something this front office has worked hard to avoid. At the same time, there are other layers developing. Linebacker depth is quietly becoming a concern. The departure of Alex Anzalone and the addition of Malcolm Rodriguez changes the dynamic of that room. There's belief the Lions can find value in the middle rounds, and history supports that, but it's still something that needs attention. You can't go into the season thin at that position and expect consistency.
And that's why the draft felt so critical this year. With 9 total picks, there's flexibility. There's room to double up at key positions. Edge could be addressed more than once. Linebacker could be reinforced. Secondary help could come into play. This is where Brad Holmes has an opportunity to show once again why he's trusted to build this roster the way he sees fit. But here is the question that keeps coming back, and it is the one that really defines everything we are talking about right now. When the moment comes, will the Lions stay patient and let the board fall to them, or will they take control and make a bold move that changes everything? And that's where things start to get even more layered, because once you accept that the Lions could stay patient or go aggressive, you have to look at the alternative paths they've quietly positioned themselves for if things don't go according to plan. One of the clearest signals right now is that Detroit is not locking itself into one single strategy when it comes to fixing the edge position. There's a strong belief internally, and even among analysts, that if the draft doesn't deliver the right value at pick 50, the Lions could pivot quickly to the trade market. Not for a blockbuster, not for something that costs premium capital, but for a calculated move that fills the gap without compromising the long-term build. And this is where shade to mid to late round value or lower cost trades start to make sense. Players who might not be elite but can rotate, contribute, and stabilize the position while your talent develops. It is not the flash move fans always want, but it is the kind of move that winning teams make when they understand roster balance. At the same time, there's also the argument for going your instead of sending picks on veterans who are already approaching their late 20s. That philosophy has been a core part of how this front office operates. If you've made it this far into your rebuild, if you've built a foundation that's starting to compete, why shortcut the process now? Why not draft a player, develop him in your system, and have him under control for years instead of paying for past production? That internal tug-of war, proven talent versus long-term development, is going to define a lot of what happens on draft weekend. Another thing that stands out when you really break all of this down is how disciplined the Lions have been about the quarterback position. Despite some outside noise suggesting they could take a flyer on a reclamation project or a high upside but inconsistent player, everything about their current structure says they are not interested in forcing that move. The system they run demands efficiency, it demands control, and more importantly, it demands trust. That's why, instead of chasing uncertainty, the smarter approach, and the one that aligns with everything they've done, is to look at the later rounds if they want to add depth at quarterback. Not someone who disrupts the room, but someone who fits the mold, learns the system, and develops quietly behind the scenes. And when you connect that back to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that this entire draft is less about one single move and more about how all the pieces come together. Edge, tackle, linebacker, secondary depth, it is all connected. You can't fix everything with one pick, and that's why having 9 selections is so important. There's also something else that can't be ignored here, and it is the emotional side of the game. The Lions community was recently hit with the tragic loss of a former player, and moments like that remind everyone how much bigger this sport is than just wins and losses. It impacts the locker room, the fanbase, the mindset going into a crucial stretch like the draft. And while it doesn't change the strategy, it adds a layer of perspective to everything that's happening right now. But even with all of that, the focus remains the same: build a roster that can take the next step. Not just making the playoffs, not just being competitive, but actually putting themselves in a position to contend at the highest level. And that's why every decision, whether it's a trade, a pick, or even a player they pass on, carries weight. Because if they hit on these decisions, if they come out of this draft with answers at edge and tackle, plus added depth across the board, this looks very different heading into the season. More complete, more dangerous, more aligned with what Dan Campbell has been built since day one. But if they miss, if those key needs aren't addressed properly, or if they rely too heavily on temporary fixes again, then you're risking running into the same problems that have held this team back before, and that's why all eyes are on Brad Holmes right now. This is the moment where preparation meets execution, where all the scouting, all the planning, all the patience gets tested in real time. And if you really think about it, that decision between patience and aggression is just about this draft. It's about defining the identity of this team moving forward. Because up to this point, the Lions have built their rise on discipline, smart drafting, calculated risks, and trusting their process. That's what got them here. That's what turned them into a team people now take seriously. But there comes a moment for every rising contender where you have to decide if sticking to the play is enough, or if it's time to push your chips to the center of the table. This draft feels like that moment. You've got a roster that's close. Not perfect, but close enough that the right additions could elevate everything. The pass rush could go from good to dangerous with one more piece. The offensive line could go from solid to dominant with the right tackle. The defense as a whole could take a leap if depth is handled the right way. And that's why every rumor, every potential trade, every scenario we talked about, it all matters. Not because all of them will happen, but because they show you the range of options this front office is considering. They are not boxing, they are not desperate, they are in position. Now it's about execution. So as draft night gets closer, keep your eyes on how the board starts to fall early. Watch for unexpected drops. Watch for teams getting aggressive ahead of Detroit. Because if the right player starts sleeping, that's when we'll find out exactly how bold this front office is willing to be. Because that moment, when a player unexpected starts to slide down the board, that's where everything changes in real time. That's where all the preparation meets instinct. You can plan for months, stack your board, run simulations over and over again, but when you're on the clock and a guy you didn't expect is suddenly within reach, that's when you find out what kind of front office you really have. And with the